I'm doing a Great British Bake Off 2024 Bake-Along. Let's get into Patisserie Week.
This week's signature bake, Laminated Breakfast Pastries, which means we're making puff pastry, which is actually something I've always wanted to try to do by hand, but have never taken the time to do so because it does take quite a bit of time. So I'm going to be making Cheese Danishes as well as some Pecan Cinnamon Swirls. And I'm really excited for this, so let's get into it.
So what exactly is puff pastry and what makes it, well, puff? The dough itself is very simple and just made up of flour, salt, butter, and water that is kneaded together until a cohesive dough forms. The magic happens when you layer this dough with butter. This process, known as lamination, creates the thin, flaky layers that puff pastry is known for. When the layers hit the oven, the liquid in the dough evaporates, causing the layers to puff without the use of any leavening agents like baking powder or soda. Anyway, to make my puff pastry, I started off by making the dough, patted it out into a rough 9x9 square, and then let it chill in the fridge overnight. Next, I needed to prep the butter block. I was surprised to learn that it's recommended to mix flour into the butter, as apparently this helps make the butter more flexible later on. Anyway, once mixed, I rolled the butter into an 8-inch square between 2 sheets of parchment paper, using a rolling pin to really push the butter into all of the corners. I then popped this into the fridge along with the dough to chill overnight. The next morning, it's time to start laminating. First things first, we need to create the dough packet. To do this, I rolled the dough into a 12x12 square, placed the butter in the center diagonally, and then folded the corners of the dough around the butter so that it was fully encased, and then pinched together the seams. I flipped it over so that it was seam side down, and then it was time to get rolling. Now this took forever, especially since the butter was still very cold at this point, but I eventually managed a 20x10-inch rectangle, which meant it was time for the first fold. I did a single or letter fold, which is just folding the pastry in thirds on top of itself, and then rolled it out a little more to make sure that the layers were really stuck together. This then went back into the fridge for 20 minutes to make sure that the butter remained nice and cold. I then repeated these steps 5 more times for a total of 6 folds. And let me tell you, this is quite the upper body workout. My arms were noticeably tired after fold 3, and my hands were quite raw from the rolling pin by the end of this. I do have to say, there's something quite relaxing about the repeated rolling and folding of dough, so it wasn't the worst way to spend a Saturday morning. After 6 folds, the dough was sufficiently laminated, so I popped it into the fridge for about 3 hours, so both of us had some time to rest. After a few hours of rest, it was time to start building some breakfast pastries. First off were the Cheese Danishes. I started by mixing together the filling, which was just cream cheese, sugar, and egg yolk, some lemon juice, and vanilla whipped together until smooth. Set that aside and then moved on to rolling out the pastry. I cut the big block of puff pastry in half and then rolled it out into an 8x16-inch rectangle, as I was aiming for 8 4x4 squares. I squared off the edges, as that's supposed to help the pastry puff, and then cut it into 8 squares. These got transferred to a parchment-lined baking sheet, where I then brushed the edges with some egg white, folded the corners over, and then brushed the entire pastry with more egg white. I then dropped a scoop of cheese filling into the center of each Danish, and then popped them into the oven to bake for about 30 minutes. Once golden brown and puffed, I transferred them to a wire rack and drizzled them with vanilla glaze. And with that, we have some 100% homemade Cheese Danishes. Moving on to the Pecan Cinnamon Swirls, I rolled out the remaining pastry into a rectangle, squared it off, and then brushed it with some melted butter. I then sprinkled on the cinnamon sugar and roasted pecans in an even layer, trying to make sure that both got all the way out to the edges. Then, with the help of a pizza cutter, I cut the dough into 12 long strips about a ½ an inch thick. I rolled these up into tight swirls and then transferred them to a parchment-lined baking sheet. These then got brushed with the remaining egg white, and then I popped them into the oven to bake for about 30 minutes. Once golden brown and puffed, I transferred them to a wire rack to cool completely. These turned out nowhere near perfect, but the fact that I achieved any sort of rise from my first attempt at homemade puff pastry is a win for me. Now for the most important question. Did these get fully baked? The answer? Kinda. The swirls were mostly there, maybe a little bit underdone in the middle. But the Danishes? Oh, that's so underbaked. Well, these sure do look pretty, but are tragically underbaked. Like, look at that raw pastry. Oh well. I do think they'll still reheat well, but I'm still gonna give this a try as is. Outside of the swirl is more baked than the inside. They don't get a ton of the pecan. Definitely the cinnamon sugar. Might depend on the bite you get. Very tasty, still has a nice flake, but the middle bit is a little raw. Now for the Danish. Flaky, buttery, cream cheesy. Just a shame that the bake wasn't right on these. Regardless, I'm definitely inspired to make more puff pastry in the future. I'll give Patisserie Week a solid B, but definitely room for improvement here. I'm gonna go pop these into the toaster oven to bake a little bit more, and I'll see you back next week for the finale.